Notice the fundamental reason, the fundamental bent of Jesus' life and activity was not passive, but outgoing active. Not towards himself, but away from himself, interestingly enough. The man did not come to be served, passive, but to serve. And that is a true picture of man. God created man. Man was created by God to live out of himself, outside of himself. There's several words that we might be able to give for that. You can take whatever you like. First of all, we might say that man was created to have an extrinsic direction or vision, to live out of himself, and not intrinsic. Not intrinsic, but extrinsic. To go out, to look away from, outside. Another word we might use is to say, and we can make this one up, that man was created by God to live extrospectively and not introspectively. Introspection is the very opposite of how God created man. We were meant by God, created by God, fashioned by God to live outside of ourselves, to live away from ourselves. If you like, jumping ahead considerably, our true freedom consists in being totally unconcerned for our freedom as such, but looking away. It was like Jesus said, remember, about losing our life, giving our life up if we are to find it and such. It lies in the very opposite direction to that we are most accustomed to think and even to hear about. Another word that we might be able to say here is the word alterocentric. Alterocentric. Man is created by God to be other-centered. To be other-centered and not, of course, ego-centric. You see, when we take our cue from Jesus of Nazareth, the man, in verse 45 of this passage, for even, notice that Jesus is saying, well, look at the man, if you like. Look at the Christ, the Son of Man. Even the Son of Man, the man, did not come to be served, but to serve. And if Jesus is the picture of the true man, and he is, if he is man as God always intended him to be, and he was, and is, then he said his life was lived outside of himself for others. So that's the first thing that we find in this passage about man. The second thing we find in the passage is this, and it is an extension of the first thing that we mentioned. The second thing is this, that not only was man created by God and made by God to live alterocentrically, outside of himself, focusing on the other, to live extrospectively and not introspectively, to live extrinsically and not intrinsically, that still doesn't take us far enough, because we haven't given any concrete content to this outgoingness that I'm saying God created us to have. We still haven't really put any concrete content into it. In other words, it would be quite possible to say that I've said man is made by God to go out of himself and to focus on the other. Therefore, man is made by God to dominate the other, and to be harsh and to rule over the other. You see, that is a possible interpretation from just my first point. But I don't want to leave it at that, because that would be a false inference. In actual fact, we learn from verse 45 again. Please notice. We learn the concrete content of this outgoingness, or this extrospective direction that God has created us for. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life. Notice, he didn't come to be served, but to serve. And that's the simple but very important concrete content of this outgoingness. Now I want you to reflect on it, because it's something that goes right against our grain. And this passage here, verses 41 to 44, or 45, this passage really is the picture of the human race in a nutshell. Everything about the human race is really gathered up in this little passage. Notice Jesus says, verse 42, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you." And I wonder whether we've taken that "not so with you" seriously enough. Certainly the Roman Catholic Church in the past has not taken it seriously enough. There's been a very high hierarchical structure, sort of gradations from Pope right down to humble communicant. And there's been cardinals and saints and a great list of descending prominence. But the Protestants also have been very triumphalistic and very hierarchical in their structure, lording it over. This is the sort of thing that you don't often find in theological seminaries and theological colleges and universities, even bearing the name Christian. There's a clear hierarchical structure there, where the faculty and such usually, they're sort of right there, and it's not simply that they are the respected leaders and such, they are that, but it's an obvious prominence. It's an obvious hierarchical structure that attaches to it. In parishes as well, the minister comes out so often like a pope, doesn't he? Not like a minister, which is, a word meaning servant, really. But there's a certain lording it over the parishioners, the people in the parish, and of course, theological education has helped to do this. Knowledge is power, and we've been able to communicate the idea that the professional theologian, the minister, he's the one who knows. All the others, they wouldn't know. Right from wrong, they don't know, they really can't understand. And so the minister so often has knowledge is power attaching to him. The sort of thing, when the minister comes into a little discussion, everyone remains quiet. Because you see, he's the expert. He's the professional. Or some of your parishioners may even say, well, look, ask the pastor. He's the one who knows. Have you ever heard that? Now what I'm saying is this, that it's so easy. It's so easy for the church to become triumphalistic and lord it over the people of God. It's so easy for the Protestants to develop their own Vatican techniques, and their own sort of lording it over. But you see, the point is, Jesus is saying here, this is the way of the Gentiles. This is the traditional given way, particularly amongst Orientals in those days and such. And if you look at the other gospel passage, you'll see that they approached Jesus like an Oriental. You see, they honoured Jesus just the way as Herod was honoured, by asking him to grant before they even gave him the request. That was a mark of honour in the ancient East. If you asked your king to grant before you even gave the request, you showed that he was so great that nothing you could ask would be beyond him granting. Remember, Herod promised up to half of his kingdom for anything that the woman would ask. Remember that, before ever she asked. He was showing how great he was by doing that, and they approached Jesus along these lines. So that verse 45 is not only a great counterblast against what the disciples were doing, but it was a great counterblast against their concept of him. You see? He didn't come to be served. Don't approach me like an Oriental despot. The Son of Man didn't come to be served. He came to serve and to give his life. How easy it is for the church to lapse into this hierarchical lording it over, where they become a sort of an ecclesiastical KGB. A sort of an ecclesiastical Kremlin. While all the time they talk about the freedom of the people. And that only adds to their hold over the people of God. So often happens this way. And of course the poor theological student, that seminarian, he has it lorded over him so much that even unconsciously he threatens that as soon as he's out and he's in his own Vatican City, it's going to be different.